What I've really found in the last couple of weeks is that while we have been up and running since 2023, it's been a little bit hard to get people to focus and want to talk about federal policy. Their eyes glaze over, like, I don't know enough about that. I don't see how it really affects us. And so, one of the things that was really stark to me when we first launched NFU, and I was like really on the like trying to learn how I was a student of the state legislature since 2016 and really understanding state policy, figuring out that federal policy isn't that different. And a lot of the nonprofits and a lot of the people that we work with within our communities really depend on federal dollars. And a lot of people figured that out when the federal freeze happened. It feels like a month ago. It wasn't. Um, but everyone started to realize how much of our community really depends on those federal dollars that come into our communities. Sometimes they go through the state and they're divvied out through grants or loans through the State Department. Some come directly from the Fed. So what this has really happened in the last couple of weeks is this really just brought so many more people to the table, and we're having a lot more conversations. And it's been really, that to me has been the positive, is that everyone's kind of come out of their silos a little bit more, and we're having these conversations and trying to educate people up on everything that is really happening. Um, but for me personally, when because of the work that I do with the nonprofits and because of my history and my personal story, anything that deals with food and food accessibility or the lack thereof, or those that are food insecure, making sure that we have food is super important to me. So when we talk about any of the policies really affect food. So when we're talking about SNAP and we're talking about Medicaid, when we're talking about even immigration, we have a lot of people that are scared to leave their homes right now. So a lot of those things kind of intersect when we're talking about food and food insecurity. So for me, that's a personal piece of it that I really um, zero in on when we're talking about federal policy.
And then for anybody new who is joining us here, I know there are a lot of familiar names and faces that we're seeing on this call, and we so appreciate your support and your interest in getting involved and hopping on during your busy weeks to join us. But for anybody who's new here, Angie, how can they get involved with the work we're doing? How can they, meet with us in person, or how can they keep up with us virtually, depending on their schedules? What are the best ways to do that and get involved?
Yeah, so right after this Zoom, I'm going to be sending you all a email that'll list some of the different things that we have going on. So the best thing that you can do is you can visit our website. You can also go out and like and share a lot of our social media posts and stay up to date that way. In this email that I'm going to send out to you next week, because the House is on recess, it's kind of the week of action, the National Week of Action. And so we actually have events that I have in that email that we're going to send out. And so there's an event happening on Monday night in conjunction with the Nebraska ACLU. Tuesday, we are doing a call-in, a virtual call-in. And Wednesday, we're doing a community coffee at the Library North on 90th Street. Saturday, we're having a free luncheon at Big Mama's. And so anyone is invited to that. That one's going to have a really big theme of we're bringing in those that are boots on the ground. They work within food pantries. We're also going to have a WIC representative there. We're going to be talking about SNAP cuts and what that would kind of mean to our food pantries here locally and to the need that we're already seeing within our communities. But please feel free to go out, like and share any of our social media posts. That's the best way that you can lift up, but also come to one of our events. Come check us out.
And just also wanted to add thank you to everybody who, already follows our social media channels. We've had a lot of traffic on there, especially lately, as there's just been so much going on. And perfect person to talk about what's going on at the national level, John Fody with Americans for Tax Fairness. Want to turn things over to you. And you'll be sharing your screen in just a moment with your presentation. So if you want to go ahead and get that set up while you do that, just wanted to let everybody know we will have just a few minutes for questions at the end. And if it's easy and something, pops up into your head while anybody is presenting at the moment, feel free to just drop your questions into chat and we can look through those as well. Don't want you to have to hold on to it and then potentially forget about it rather at the end. So, John, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Colin. And again, just really appreciate being with you all this evening to have this really important conversation. And just one thing I want to say off the bat, one policy area more than any that is dense and complicated is taxes. But you don't have to know the ins and outs of the tax code to be an expert. For one, all of us pay taxes. That right off the bat makes you an expert. But more importantly, you have a an experience and story, and so do many of the folks you likely work with and maybe help organize. So that makes you an expert, even if a lot of this material can be a little bit dense. But really, this fight this year over the current congressional majority's plan to renew the 2017 tax cut law is really about stopping our money and our healthcare and our nutrition assistance being taken away from us to fund tax cuts for billionaires and big corporations. Let me just, there we go. So you might be wondering what is expiring at the end of the year that is spurring the current majority to rush to extend these tax cuts. And here is a little bit of a breakdown for you for all those provisions. And just to say, some of these numbers you're seeing right now in this chart fluctuate a little bit based off of certain basic calculations you're using. And also just to say, with costs rising, so does service on the national debt. So actually, this number is actually a little bit of outdated. In the last month, as you'll see shortly, the Congressional Budget Office has said that the extending the Trump tax cuts will actually cost even more than initially thought. But as you can see here, the reduced income tax brackets for wealthy individuals, exemptions to what is known as the alternative minimum tax, which is basically a minimum tax that wealthy people must pay. House Republicans in 2017 created new exemptions for that. There was this new pass-through loophole created that basically allowed wealthy individuals who file their taxes as LLCs or S corporations to take a special 20% tax rate on their income. So just to give you some example, Michael Bloomberg and 7 other billionaires reduced their tax liability by nearly $200 million in a single year by taking advantage of that loophole. And there's various other things. The estate tax exemption. Again, unless you're making $27 million a year when you pass away, you're not paying the estate tax. And various other of these other programs. But more importantly, here is some important statistics about what this all means. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that now it'll cost $5.5 trillion to extend the Trump tax cuts that expire at the end of the year. And even worse, the CBO found that this would decrease economic growth over the next 10 years by 0.1% of GDP. So basically, even if you discount that decrease, extending the Trump tax cuts won't have any real economic benefit for the economy at large. And even worse, $2.5 trillion of that $5.5 trillion would solely go to corporations, businesses, and households with incomes over $400,000. We're talking about the wealthiest of the wealthy there, and that is just an incredibly expensive amount of money to be giving away to folks at the higher end of the income spectrum when we could be better using that money to support child care, home care, and various other policy proposals. And who benefits from the Trump tax cut extension? The top 1% of earners will receive a $61,000 tax cut, and those 0.1% will receive $250,000 of a tax cut per year. Meanwhile, the bottom 60% of families, so most families across America, will only see $1 a day from the Trump tax cuts. And when you factor in inflation and other rising costs, that basically means that most folks are looking at a tax increase while the wealthy are getting the size of their yearly income in a single tax cut. And here are some of the major provisions of the 2017 law that cut taxes specifically for the rich. One thing to say is that the original 2017 law made a lot of the corporate provisions permanent while they set the individual provisions to expire. So basically, corporations got a free lifelong tax cut while the rest of us had this sort of hanging over our heads for the last 10 years. This also reduced the ordinary income tax top tax rate from 39.5% to 37%. Like I said, it introduced a new special tax break for business income known as the pass-through loophole. And again, it doubled the estate tax exemption from to $27 million today, up from $11 million in 2017. And again, unless your estate has $11 million in that, you're not paying any single amount of the estate tax. And here is just a really helpful chart to show how skewed the Trump tax cuts were to those on the upper end of the income spectrum. Again, as you can see here, if you're someone making under $100,000, you're barely getting anything from the Trump tax cuts. Meanwhile, folks who are making above 200K are getting a significant amount of tax cuts. And again, all of that is an expenditure, right? This isn't just free money. This is money that low and middle income people end up paying into the treasury that then ends up back in wealthy individuals' pockets. And again, the corporate tax rate cut in 2017 didn't do anything to trickle down to workers. I don't know about you, but most middle class workers aren't making $167,000 a year. And that's how much you needed to be making in order to see any significant benefit from the Trump tax law. And again, executives who were making $1 million a year were getting the average income of a family in a tax break back. Again, just a tremendous waste of resources that could otherwise be going to better use. And here is a great graph that shows how tax cuts basically mean we end up underfunding really important programs. As you can see here, this little spike in 2010, all of that is from the Obama era post Great Recession package. So basically, those were kind of temporary increases. But at every other point, here in 2013, when the Bush tax cuts were extended on a bipartisan basis, that immediately led to a drop off in housing, nutrition assistance, education, and job training programs. And this flat funding here, basically means that we're barely keeping up with inflation as these programs go on year over year. Meanwhile, we know that millions of more families need access to these programs in order to be able to lift themselves up and support their communities. And if the Trump tax plan from the campaign and what the president has said he wants to enact, these are various proposals you've probably heard of: no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime, some other various proposals that are out there. If we, in a perfect world, imagine that the president and the congressional majority are able to achieve everything that they said they want to achieve, it would mean that most people will see their taxes increase unless they are making $360,000 a year. The minimum, most of us are looking at our tax bill going up by $600. Meanwhile, folks who are on the wealthiest end of the spectrum will be getting at least $7,000 back in tax cuts. And again, all of this, not only would this end up raising costs on most people, but then when you think about some of the other things this is going to be paired with, really daily services are about to get really expensive in addition to our tax bills going up. And just today, the House Republican majority released their budget framework. And this is what they're looking at doing to pay for their tax cuts. That $230 billion from the Agriculture Committee is going to come directly out of nutrition assistance programs like SNAP. That $880 billion and the Energy and Commerce Committee, very obscure name. You're probably wondering, what the heck do they deal with? Well, that is the House committee that deals with Medicaid. And there is not a single program in the House Energy and Commerce's committee that has as much money in it as Medicaid. So that $880 billion means that we are looking at a nearly $1 trillion cut to Medicaid, which could jeopardize healthcare for nearly 40 million people across the country. And here's what they're planning to do as of right now, when we read their budget resolution. The House Republican budget plan would cut Medicaid, as I just said, by $880 billion, SNAP by $230 billion, while giving wealthy folks that same amount of money in tax cuts. And that's just if we're looking at folks who are making $750,000 or more. So they are quite literally taking healthcare and nutrition assistance away from people and transferring that wealth over to rich people in the form of tax cuts. And again, they're paying for this. And so when you're paying for something, that means you're taking money from one source and giving it to another in order to complete that transaction. So here are some key messages that we at Americans for Tax Fairness are driving. And just to say, when we say House Republicans here, we do not mean this in a political context. We just mean they released this bill, this is what it says, and this is what they plan to do, and we're taking them at their word. So they unveiled a new billionaire first budget that will directly increase costs for millions of working families, to fund tax breaks for billionaires and corporations. That budget would, at a minimum, force $1 trillion in cuts to Medicaid and nutrition assistance and many other basic services that our families and communities rely on. And besides making a few billionaires and millionaires even richer, this proposal and their extreme cuts will only raise prices for families, and people who are already struggling. So we really, we are living under the Trump tax cuts right now. And just to say, on a little nerdy note, the House Ways and Means Instruction, which is the committee charged with tax writing, they only have $4.5 trillion to spend, which basically means they're only able to do what the Trump tax cuts are already doing. So that is not going to change anything right now for working people. If people are unsatisfied with the tax regime they're currently living under, we should inform them that that is the Trump tax cuts, and we have an opportunity, to reverse that at the end of the year by Congress simply doing nothing. If Congress does nothing, we gain basically $5.5 trillion of new revenue, mostly coming from the wealthy. And at that point, rather than focusing on making sure that we're providing $2.5 trillion of tax breaks for the wealthy, we could then focus on things like the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, other various proposals that will actually go towards low and middle income people, and make sure that they can support their families and their communities. And if you're curious about how this might impact, let's say, folks in the Nebraska Second District, for example, there's this great tool, from the House Budget Committee that came out today, that will show you how much the average annual tax cut for the richest folks, in a district or across the country will be getting, how much money is being given away, to those folks, and also what is threatened under that, proposal. Whether it's the Affordable Care Act, and healthcare that's offered to folks through there, whether it's Medicaid, and I was not able to capture the entire screen here there, but there is nutrition assistance that's also a part of that. And I would really encourage folks to use that as a resource. Again, what we're really trying to make sure is that every member of Congress understands the impact on their constituents before they take this vote. And that is the thing that is most important, and that it should persuade them, one way or the other, when they take that final vote on a bill, to really think about the impact on their constituents rather than what other Washington politicians are trying to convince them to do.
A lot of great information there. Thank you so much for being able to uh, really encapsulate all of that, especially with developments that came out today. As we mentioned at the top of this webinar, there's just so much going on, lots of information coming out from time to time, and really appreciate everybody who's been dropping in their comments so far. Did just want to add that Angie did put a link to that tool that Fody mentioned in his presentation. So feel free to check that out as you wish, and continue dropping in any questions, observations. Lots of great data in here from some of you as well. So thank you for sharing that too. Obviously, this is a very important subject, and do want to make sure that we're looking at things at the state level as well. I think one of the things that's been fascinating, at least from perspective, is taking a look at a lot of different, comparison maps of how different funding cuts at the federal level impact different states, and really getting a better sense of which states are more reliant on some of those funds versus others. And I know just about everybody on this call is from Nebraska, and is involved in Nebraska in one way or another. So did want to turn things over to Dr. Firestone to talk a little bit more about some of the work and data that OpenSky Policy Institute has, really get a deeper dive into what's happening at the state level. There's obviously a lot going on with the budget here, in addition to what's happening nationally as well. And so I think it's a great opportunity to be able to have Dr. Firestone join us, and feel free to begin now that we have your presentation on the screen.
All right, thanks so much, Colin. And I just want to give a shout out to the team at OpenSky for helping put these materials together as we've been doing our very rapid learning on the intersections between federal and state funding in Nebraska. So we have a few slides to share with you today, assuming that the slideshow is going to work. We wanted to talk a little bit about what the scope of federal funding in Nebraska looks like in a couple of key areas: education, healthcare, and transportation, and then try to lay out for you a little bit of what the potential implications are for changing the funding flows that are coming into the state. And I will say that at OpenSky, we spend a lot more time on education and on healthcare than on transportation, so bear with us as we are learning. So our state's total operating budget for fiscal year 26-27 is $18.95 billion, about $19 billion. And about 34% of that that comes into the state budget comes from federal funding. And we are about average across the states for the amount of federal funding that is coming in to support state operations. Louisiana is one of the states that draws down a substantial amount of federal funding. North Dakota, I think, is the state that draws down the least amount of federal funding. Some of those big ticket items, the biggest ticket item really, as John and Angie were discussing, is for Medicaid coming into our Department of Health and Human Services, about $4.6 billion. We also just wanted to highlight there is a decent amount of money that is coming in from the U.S. Department of Education via the Nebraska Department of Education. The total amount of federal funding that comes into the state, our estimate is about $9.7 billion. And that comes in through a variety of different mechanisms, as Angie was saying. That comes in sort of directly through via the state to support programs administered by the state. We have a number of other entities in the state, however, that do receive federal funding. For example, our nonprofits, our university system. There are a couple different mechanisms by which these changes in federal funding are slated to occur this year that we are tracking. One is through the series of federal executive orders that have been issued over the past month across a variety of different sectors. And so that's coming in from the executive branch. And then, as John was discussing, these congressional budget negotiations. So we've got a couple different branches of government that are at the federal level that are looking to change the amount of federal funding that is coming to the state. Our top line analysis about all of this is that any substantial reduction in federal funding, whether it comes in through federal action or through these congressional budget negotiations, are going to mean a shift in cost to the state, for the state of Nebraska to have to pick up the difference, or a substantial reduction in services, or both. This is just to give you a picture of where the state of Nebraska right now spends most of its money. This is state of Nebraska money. This comes from one of our publications on tax and budget policy in the state. And you can see that the big ticket items of what the state spends on are Medicaid and CHIP and Health and Human Services. Also, substantial amount of spending overall within our state general funds that goes through K through 12 education and higher education. I do want to note that this 1% here is the very small portion that the state spends comparatively on transportation and infrastructure. So top line, when we're looking at what might be happening with action on the federal level that relates to transportation and infrastructure funds, that is a bigger portion of the pie in terms of transportation and infrastructure spending in the state than anything that the state of Nebraska actually puts forward. But to dig in on Medicaid, so as I said before, Nebraska itself Total spent about $4 billion on Medicaid and on CHIP, which is the Children's Health Insurance Program. Federal funding made up about 69% of that amount. A key concept for us to be aware of is what's called in policy terms the FMAP. And this is the matching percentage between how much the state of Nebraska puts in to pay for Medicaid and how much the feds basically match how much money Nebraska is putting in. So right now in fiscal year 2025, our FMAP is 57.52%, which basically means that for every dollar that the state of Nebraska spends, it receives about $1.43 from the federal government. You can see that from 24 to 25, our FMAP went down for Medicaid. Our FMAPs can never go below 50% because that would basically mean there's like a 50-50 match between the states and the feds. Having gone down from 58.6 to 57.52 is a sign that the Nebraska economy is strong. At the federal level, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare calculates each state's FMAP each year. And the closer you get to 50%, the more of a sign that your state economy can actually is robust enough to be able to contribute substantially to Medicaid. So we have a strong economy. That means the state of Nebraska should be putting in more. And this FMAP rate is one of the things that in budget negotiations at the federal level becomes we're expecting to become a topic of debate. To talk a little bit about how state funding how federal funding comes into the state. Our total amount of spending on K through 12 education in the state recently was about $5 billion. And about only 8% of that is federally funded. So for those of us who spend a lot of time tracking the property tax debate here in Nebraska, a lot of that really has to do with local property taxes are like a really essential funding source for how we pay for our schools in the state. The other funding source is state funding from the overall state of Nebraska. So even though the feds don't pay a substantial portion of K through 12 funding, those funding mechanisms are really important for leveling the playing field and ensuring sort of fair and equal opportunity for some key populations of students in the state. So one of the programs that's used for that is ESSA funding, which is also called Title I, which funds schools in low-income communities to the tune of about $68 million. And then also funding that comes in under IDEA, which is for special education. And a key thing that I think we're going to be keeping an eye on at OpenSky is that on the state level in 2023, the state of Nebraska agreed to increase the amount by which it reimburses school districts for their special education expenditures to go up to 80% of what school districts pay. And then that commitment sort of feeds up under IDEA to this notion of a maintenance of effort. So the Federal Department of Education is looking at what types of commitments school districts and the state are spending on special education expenses. And they sort of use the availability of federal funding basically both as a carrot and as a stick. So if we see any substantial reduction in federal special education funding, it does potentially mean that the sort of long-standing commitment on the part of the state for how much they're going to spend on special education could potentially be at risk. Transportation, I think what we were able to pull together for you was we're looking at the 2021 Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provided Nebraska with $499 million in funding for highway maintenance. So that's a very big ticket amount of funding that's going into infrastructure in the state, which may potentially be in jeopardy at this point in time. To drill that down into what that means specifically, there was a $2.9 million grant that Eppley Airfield received just this past year to help with their airport improvements that is coming from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And so some of that funding could potentially now be at risk, which I'm not suggesting that necessarily means that our airport improvements are going to be at risk, but that is the funding stream that is being considered for infrastructure that is part of the overall review of federal funding that the Trump administration is looking at. This funding is certainly part of what they are reviewing. What does this mean? Our analysis suggests that these federal funding cuts would leave Nebraska, the state, sort of unequipped to serve its most vulnerable students, potentially. We're looking at specific threats to Medicaid in the form of per capita caps on spending, where Medicaid could be cut such that only a flat amount of funding is provided to Medicaid, regardless of the healthcare needs of the individual who participates in Medicaid. We could see reductions in that FMAP rate. We could also see just a block grant that then goes to the state, and the state then gets to decide how they're potentially going to fund that, or how they're going to allocate that. And if we're looking at sort of the magnitude of like, what does that mean for Nebraskans? Right now, about 330,000 Nebraskans are on Medicaid, 151,000 of which are kids. So we're talking about a fairly substantial portion of the Nebraska population that is on Medicaid, and most of those folks are working. They're already employed. They may just not meet income thresholds to be able to get health care on their own. And so they are eligible for Medicaid. The cuts to Title I or IDEA funding could make it harder for the state to level the playing field in funding. The state's worked really hard on education funding over the past couple of years to deal with that property tax issue. It could be harder for the state to maintain those commitments, and the state certainly doesn't have the existing degree of resources available to pay for highway maintenance or broadband infrastructure the way that the feds do. We are also looking at a budget shortfall right now in the state. You've probably heard some folks at OpenSky talking about that. That budget gap, unlike at the federal level, at the state level, we have to balance our budget. So the Nebraska legislature is going to need to find a way to fill that projected shortfall, which has to do with the state of Nebraska having made a commitment to lower its income tax revenues over the next couple of years in the context of inflation and growing costs for just the business of running state agencies. Some of what we're seeing right now in the proposals to balance the budget include a proposal to draw back on a large commitment that has been made recently to fund broadband at the state level to the tune of $20 million. Potentially a $14 million cut to the University of Nebraska system that has been proposed. We are also, however, looking at the state trying to maintain its commitments to fund our current Medicaid program. So that change in the FMAP that I was talking about earlier to go from 58% down to 57% does require the state of Nebraska to put more money into our Medicaid program. The current budget proposals that's been introduced in the legislature does plan to increase the amount of money going into Medicaid, while also looking to draw down more federal funding through a tax on healthcare providers. But if we are looking at our Medicaid program on the federal level being cut drastically back, it's not clear that the state is going to be able to advance its strategy of trying to draw down federal funding, or if it's going to be able to maintain its current commitments to Medicaid in the context of this budget shortfall. That is what I have for you this evening. So this is how to contact us if you're looking for more information from the OpenSky team. And with that, Colin, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
All right, thank you so much. And we're just a little bit ahead of schedule. So just wanted to take the rest of the time available to make sure that if anybody did have any questions, you can either drop them in the chat, or I believe you can unmute yourself. Angie, correct me if I'm wrong there. If someone wants to ask a question, feel free to drop those in. I've seen a few that have already been dropped in the chat so far, and it looks like they've been addressed and answered, and lots of great observations as well. I will also add that Fodi just dropped in a lot of great resources as well that are great for you to look at. So we'll just give a moment or two if there are any questions that anybody has. Otherwise, you're welcome to reach out directly to me. I believe everybody would have received the Zoom link and my email would have been included on there when it was sent out. So feel free to reach out to me directly as well, and I can make sure to put you in touch with the right representative available, whether it's on the state side or the federal side as well. But just want to make sure that if you know a question comes up for you, later, happy to help with answering that as well. It looks like Cindy's raising her hand. So Cindy, if you'd like to uh, unmute yourself, feel free to ask away.
Thank you so much. And I first wanted to ask, it sounds like this is being recorded. Will all the resources please be attached as well in the email? I would love to be able to look through some of these articles. I appreciate that. I'm trying to wrap my head around where Nebraskans access their health coverage. Is there any resource to understand how many either individuals or percentage wise cover in Nebraska either Medicaid, Medicare, ACA, those of us that are business individuals on the open market, and employer sponsored? I'm just trying to kind of understand where the bulk of us are in Nebraska as far as to be impacted by some of these changes. I don't know if that makes sense.
I'm not sure if that's in any of our wheelhouses specifically when it comes to uh, other forms of insurance. I know specifically, at least at the federal level, when it comes to funding, it appears that Medicaid is the most at risk and seems to be the one that is most in danger, but would be happy to look to what others have to share as well. And one other thing I'll add, just to address what you had asked previously, I'm going to be compiling all of these links in the next few moments so that we'll be able to share those as a resource as well afterwards, so you don't have to try and save all of them yourself.
I appreciate that. I was talking to someone earlier, and they really, I think, had the impression that when you talk about a number of people that might be on Medicaid in our state, they were unsure of how to imagine like the number of neighbors that would be, what would be the percentage of people that that this will impact. And I know there was something from the Kaiser Institute organization about, like the number of people in nursing homes that would be impacted by this. And it sometimes helps to just say, if you imagine X number of people, this would help people with their I want to say empathy, but just the better understanding, about the impact this is going to have.
I can try to step in on that one, Cindy, to help you with that. So I think we have a recent estimate that there's about 330,000 Nebraskans who are on Medicaid. And I like to think that that is roughly equivalent to how many kids are in K through 12 education in the state.
Wow. Okay, that puts something into perspective for me. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And someone's just saying in the state, our current population is about 1.9 million. So I'm not going to try to do math on the fly, but I think we can probably estimate the percentage. But just to help us understand the magnitude of how many people would that be, how many people are on on Medicaid in Nebraska, I do think it is kind of helpful to think like, well, how many kids are in K through 12 education in the state?
One other thing I did want to point out, this was just relayed by someone else in the chat is just a general question to people if they're contacting their senators, congressional representatives. Angie, I know that we are really big, at least at Nebraska For Us, in encouraging people to make sure that they are reaching out to their representatives, no matter, what district or state that they live in, because they're elected to represent us and need to know, what our perspectives are. So would love to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on why it's so important to be able to reach out to those representatives rather than just, sitting here and talking and then just kind of going on our merry little way.
Yeah. So, Fody, I'm gonna push this over to you, but I also wanted you to not only answer that question or help us frame up that question, because I know that we've been hearing from our delegates that they have been overrun with phone calls, emails, and so we're just encouraging people to continue that conversation, letting them know it's most important if you have a personal story of why you believe that why this subject, whatever it may be, is so important to you. Create that story for them, because a lot of those stories build up to create them some air cover so that they can support the policies that we really care about. But Fody, I was wanting for you, the one thing that we really haven't tackled tonight was just kind of that overall picture, because we had the federal freeze come through, we've had executive orders. Today, the House GOP dropped their budget resolution. What are the future steps? Like, what are we looking forward to in the next 6 weeks, really, to 8 weeks? How can you frame this for us in a broader picture so we understand how all of this fits together?
Yeah, Angie, super appreciate the opportunity to weigh in here. And just agree. The best thing you can do is make a phone call yourself and find a couple other friends to do the same thing. And just to say, right now, the House and Senate are actually on diverging paths on their budget resolution. The Senate's actually doing a what they're calling a skinny budget resolution, which would invest dollars in defense, immigration, as well as some energy policies, while potentially also making cuts to SNAP and Medicaid to help fund part of that. So they might try to do a little bit of this now so it doesn't look as terrible now. But like I said, on the House side, they're trying to do all of this all at once. So really, Congress can't pass a reconciliation bill, the sort of uniparty process by which they can pass bills through a simple majority to affect the budget, unless the House and Senate pass the same budget resolution with the same plan to them both. So otherwise, until this sort of gets resolved, we might be in a little bit of a stalemate. But the moment that they agree on that path forward, they are planning to move forward with enacting a lot of these policies. What we have heard is that if the House succeeds over the next 48 hours, and then when they get back from congressional recess and passing their budget resolution, they plan to have all of their committees compile that massive bill by March 27th. So this will be a really rapid timeline. If you put that at the end of the congressional recess, that's pretty much over a month that you have to weigh in with your representatives and let them know how this is going to affect you. And that's what I would say too is, you don't need to have all the tax stuff on the end of this to be able to weigh in. If you're worried about cuts to a specific program, that is simple enough to make a 5-minute phone call. And if I could also say, everything we have heard from House and Senate leaders is that their phones are ringing more than they ever have at any point. Most senators have told me that they're hearing infinitely more from folks after the funding freeze, and now that money is being frozen to also fund these tax cuts. All of this is more than what they heard during the ACA fight. And in fact, a particular senator said they have not heard from this many people since the Iraq War. So it is making a difference. If I can also share some information, some folks in Maine have been calling so much that their senators' voicemail boxes are completely full. And at one point, the phones were even disconnected. So what I would say is that might be a little frustrating if you call and get a voicemail, but leave that voicemail. Then call the district office, because I bet you the district office might have someone there who's able to hear from you. And again, that takes 10 minutes to call call and make sure you talk to someone and you weigh in, and that you know for sure that that office has heard from you. Because eventually, if they succeed, we're going to want to hold folks accountable if programs that our communities rely on end up getting cut to finance those tax breaks. So again, like that is really a superpower right now. And even just to say, there are some congressional offices who won't meet with DC lobbyists like myself because they're trying to stem the tide of their meetings. And so they're telling us we will only meet if you have a constituent in your meeting. So that means really everything you all can do is really a superpower in this moment where it can really make or break a difference. And like I said at the top, the one thing you need to ask your member of Congress is to make sure they're thinking about you rather than the leadership of their political party when they make that final vote on that legislation.
Thank you so
And
much. Go ahead.
And I was just going to say, yes, Elizabeth, repeated calls, absolutely. I would say, and if you don't want to be annoying to some poor 22-year-old staffer, do it once a week, or wait to hear when those action alerts go out to weigh in. But I would say once a week, twice a week, if you're feeling particularly squirrely, go ahead and do it. And like I said, it's also always good to, bring a friend to do it with you, because that's the other thing. These are also very personal stories sometimes. So it might also be better to be able to sit down with someone who you trust and do that together.
Thank you. I do want to close with it's okay to not have all the answers. And it's okay to not understand everything that we even talked about tonight. It's okay to pick that one thing or two things that you want to focus on right now. I talk to a lot of people, and we all need to take care of ourselves during this time and make sure that we are taking care of our own mental health right now. There's a lot of folks that are like, after listening to Dr. Firestone, I'm a little stressed out. My anxiety is pretty high. Like it definitely feels like doomsday. But know that there's some really smart people and some really good people that are out paying attention to all of this. So if you need to take a break tonight, tomorrow, that's okay, to step away and then come back to the fight whenever you're available and whenever you feel safe to do so. But just know that we are here to be a resource. If you ever have any questions and you don't understand how anything intersects, please feel free to reach out to OpenSky. There's some amazing, incredibly smart people over there. We are going to try to do a one-pager here at NFU. I'm a huge fan of one-pagers, so people can kind of have a glimpse of how federal policy and the budget resolution and the things that they want to cut and how it really affects Nebraskans, so that you can have it with you and be like, what did Angie talk about? And what did OpenSky talk about? What are the numbers? Like how many people are in Medicaid, and how many people would be affected by SNAP cuts, so that you would have that information on the ready too. So we'll try to be creating some resources in the next week or two. Again, just as a reminder, I will be sending out an email to you. So thank you so much for attending tonight. Colin, I will hand it over to you. It looks like there's a lot of stuff going on in the chat right now. So
it is. We're mostly just getting a lot of thank yous from the audience and just really appreciative of the information. And I echo that as well. Really appreciate everyone's expertise tonight as we really absorb a lot of information. So we will continue to follow what's going on. Thank you, everybody, for your questions, your interest, your involvement. Obviously, we're all, involved in different ways, and definitely, we echo the sentiment that it's really important to reach out to your representatives and make sure that your voices are heard, because without that, they may not know. And it's really important to just have that visibility out there. So thank you, everybody, again, for taking the time today. Really appreciate you hopping on. We will make sure that this recording is available. I've captured all of the links, and we'll be sure to share those as well, so you have access to the resources. And feel free to email me directly if there are any other questions. But hope everybody stays warm. Hope all the shoveling is done from the snow that fell overnight and into today. And we'll see you all soon, whether it's virtually on our newsletter or at an in-person event in the near future. Have a great night, everybody.